The morning sky was thick with heavy gray clouds that stretched endlessly above the Arlington Memorial Cemetery. The air, damp and crisp, clung to the neatly aligned rows of soldiers standing at attention. Their faces were somber, yet composed, as they paid their final respects to their fallen comrade. The unmistakable scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the sharp smell of polished brass and pressed uniforms. The rhythmic echo of boots striking the ground filled the air as the honor guard prepared for the final tribute, 3 rifle volleys in honor of their fallen leader. At the front of the gathering, General Emily Turner stood by the podium, her navy blue uniform adorned with ribbons and medals that reflected her decades of service. At 55, Turner carried herself with the authority of a woman who had faced every challenge the military had to offer. Her cropped black hair, streaked with silver, hinted at the years of experience that defined her. She wasn't just a senior officer today, she was a friend mourning the loss of Colonel Henry Fitzgerald, a man she had worked with for 20 years. His sudden death in a training accident had shaken the entire division, leaving a hole in the hearts of those who had known him. Turner had taken a deep breath before stepping up to the podium, her mind focused on the man she would honor in her words. As she spoke of Fitzgerald's courage, integrity, and service to his country, the crowd shifted uneasily. Her voice, steady and commanding, was only slightly interrupted by a quiet shuffle in the distance. It was so faint that Turner almost didn't notice it, but her instincts kicked in, trained over decades of navigating the most dangerous of situations. She continued speaking, undeterred, but her eyes subtly swept over the crowd. There, near the back of the group, was the figure that had caught her attention. A man in a black trench coat, his posture rigid, hands buried deep in his pockets. His flushed face was tense, his eyes locked onto hers with an unmistakable intensity. Turner didn't recognize him personally, but she knew who he was. Officer Mark Riddell, a sergeant with the Fairfax County Police Department. His reputation had preceded him, a cop known for his aggressive use of force, whose history of complaints had been buried under layers of internal reviews and technicalities. Riddell's gaze never wavered. He was staring at Turner like a man possessed, pushing his way through the crowd. People instinctively stepped back as he advanced, a few civilians whispering in confusion and unease. Turner knew she had to remain calm. Everything in her body screamed for caution, but she couldn't show fear. She couldn't allow herself to lose control now. Not here, not today. She continued her speech, maintaining the steady rhythm of her words, but her mind was racing. Something was wrong, and then it happened. Riddell reached his destination, right behind the front row of officers. Without warning, he yanked his hand from his pocket and pulled out a gun. The crowd gasped collectively, the sound of it slicing through the thick air like a knife. Riddell's aim was clear. The barrel of the gun was pointed directly at General Turner's chest. For a split second, everything froze. Time seemed to stretch as every eye in the cemetery focused on the weapon, its glint catching the dim light. A collective breath was held in silence. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise, but it was drowned out by the pounding in Turner's chest. The military officers at the podium reacted immediately, their hands reaching for their holstered weapons, their bodies tense. Civilians ducked behind headstones, their hearts racing, but Turner didn't flinch. She stood there, facing Riddell with calm, unwavering resolve. Her training, the years spent in combat zones, leading missions, and facing countless adversaries, had steeled her for moments like this. There was no fear in her eyes, no panic. If this was to be her last moment, she would meet it head-on, with the same discipline that had defined her entire career. "Put the weapon down, Sergeant," she said, her voice even but carrying the weight of authority. Riddell's grip tightened on the gun, his knuckles turning white. His breathing was heavy, ragged. There was something wild in his eyes, something broken. But Turner didn't back down. "Sergeant, put the gun down," she repeated, her voice cutting through the growing tension. Behind her, Colonel Jason Hayes, a close colleague, stepped forward, his own hand hovering near his sidearm. "Mark, think about what you're doing," Hayes called out, his voice firm but pleading. "This is a funeral. This is not the place for this." Riddell's eyes flicked briefly to Hayes, but his focus remained on Turner. The gun trembled in his grip, but he didn't lower it. The moment had arrived. The tension was unbearable, and the question hung in the air. What would happen next? The air seemed to thicken around them as Riddell's finger hovered just over the trigger. General Turner didn't flinch. Years of training had taught her how to read a situation, how to stay calm under pressure. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, but she didn't allow herself to be distracted. This wasn't just about her. If Riddell fired, it wouldn't only be an attack on her, it would be an attack on everything she stood for. The military, the men and women she had served beside, and the ideals they fought to protect. "Sergeant, lower your weapon," Turner repeated, her voice now cutting through the tension like a blade. Riddell's eyes burned with intensity, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths. He wasn't listening to reason. His mind seemed to be somewhere else, consumed by something darker. And in that moment, it was clear to Turner that this wasn't just about a dispute. It was something far more personal for Riddell. Behind her, Colonel Hayes, standing a few steps away, moved slightly to the left, keeping his hand on his own weapon. He was hoping to find an opening, some way to de-escalate the situation, but he knew it was dangerous to make any sudden movements. The officers and soldiers near the podium had begun to position themselves, preparing to intervene, but they too were frozen by the sight of the gun aimed squarely at their commanding officer. Turner's mind raced. She could hear the whispers behind her, the gasps from the crowd. The honor guards stood at attention, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. The civilians who had come to mourn had already begun to step back, instinctively seeking cover. But not Turner. She stood tall, unyielding, waiting for the moment to act. "Mark, don't do this," Hayes pleaded again, his voice more urgent now. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't you." But Riddell didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Turner, his grip tightening further. His hands shook, a sign of the internal battle raging inside him. Turner's voice softened as she continued, trying to connect with him on some human level, hoping for a break in his focus. "Mark, whatever you think you're doing, it's not worth it. You're better than this." For a brief moment, there was a flicker in Riddell's eyes, a hesitation, a doubt. It was all it took. Captain Greg Daniels, who had been waiting for the slightest sign of weakness, moved swiftly. He lunged forward, grabbing Riddell's arm and forcing the gun upward. A single shot rang out, splitting the silence. The sound was deafening in the stillness of the cemetery. But it wasn't aimed at Turner. The bullet fired into the air as the struggle continued. Riddell fought back, twisting violently in Daniels' grip, his free hand reaching for the gun. He swung wildly, desperate to regain control. The officers near the podium rushed in, jumping on top of him in a flurry of movement, their bodies crashing against the wet grass as they wrestled him to the ground. The struggle was intense. Riddell was strong, but the officers were relentless. Within seconds, Riddell was subdued. 4 officers piled on top of him, pinning him to the ground. His gun was knocked out of his hand and kicked away. He screamed in anger, thrashing beneath the weight of the officers holding him down. But it was over. General Turner watched as Riddell's resistance slowly faded. He was handcuffed, his body still trembling beneath the men who restrained him. His face was twisted with rage, but it was clear to Turner now. He was broken. He had lost. And she, despite the chaos that had erupted around her, had remained standing. She didn't move as the officers dragged Riddell away, his body still jerking in a futile attempt to break free. Turner turned slowly, adjusting her uniform, brushing off the dust from her sleeve as she stepped back toward the podium. The funeral, despite everything that had just transpired, had to continue. It wasn't about her, it was about honoring Colonel Fitzgerald's sacrifice. As Officer Mark Riddell was pulled away, the eerie silence that hung over the cemetery seemed almost unbearable. The gunshot, though fired harmlessly into the sky, had shattered the solemnity of the ceremony, and the chaos that followed lingered like an unwelcome shadow. The crowd, still reeling from the near tragedy, began to slowly move, some in a daze, others shaking their heads as if to convince themselves that what they had just witnessed was nothing more than a nightmare. But it was real. The terror that had briefly gripped them was all too real. General Emily Turner, still standing resolutely at the podium, had not flinched when the shot rang out. She had remained calm in the face of danger, just as she had been trained to do over the course of her military career. But now, as the officers struggled to subdue Riddell, her thoughts raced. How had it come to this? How had a man sworn to protect the people around him turned his weapon against a military officer, against her, in front of so many? As Riddell was dragged away in handcuffs, his face still contorted with anger, Turner's gaze remained fixed on him. His muffled protests faded into the background as officers and soldiers moved swiftly to regain control of the situation. They worked in unison, not missing a beat as they ensured the crowd was safe. Some of the civilians, still huddled behind tombstones, began to emerge cautiously, unsure of what had just transpired. But they were unharmed. The immediate danger had passed. "Get him out of here," Colonel Jason Hayes ordered, his voice firm but laced with the tension that had gripped them all. The officers assigned to take Riddell into custody moved quickly, their hands gripping his arms as they escorted him toward the nearest squad car. He twisted in their grasp, his feet barely touching the ground. But there was no escaping now. The fight was over, and Riddell's moment of madness had led him straight into the hands of the law. As he was shoved into the back of the cruiser, his eyes locked once more with General Turner's. The hatred was palpable in his glare, and his voice, though muffled by the car doors, still rang out in defiance. "This isn't over," he shouted, his words almost lost in the wind. "You don't belong here." Turner's expression remained unchanged as she looked at him. No words escaped her lips. There was no need. She had done what she needed to do. She had maintained control, even in the face of a gun aimed directly at her. There was no triumph, no satisfaction in her eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice had been served, at least for now. As the squad car pulled away, the soldiers and officers around her began to resume their positions. It was clear that the funeral could not continue as it had before. The honor guard hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether to proceed with the planned rifle volley. The tension in the air was palpable. It felt wrong to move forward so quickly, as if the entire ceremony had been tainted. But General Turner, ever the leader, didn't allow for hesitation. She adjusted her uniform one last time and stepped forward, lifting the microphone once again. "Proceed," she commanded, her voice firm and unwavering. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The soldiers around her moved quickly, snapping to attention. One by one, they raised their rifles, their movements synchronized and precise. A crisp stillness settled over them as they prepared for the final tribute to Colonel Henry Fitzgerald. And then, with a unified motion, 3 sharp volleys of gunfire pierced the sky, echoing across the cemetery. The sound cut through the tension, reclaiming the silence that had been stolen. The funeral had resumed, but in the wake of what had happened, it would never be the same. The crowd, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, watched in stunned silence as the ceremony continued. Some were still shaken, but others stood tall, their faces reflecting the strength that had been required of them in the face of unimaginable violence. Turner remained at the podium, her eyes focused on the flag-draped casket of Colonel Fitzgerald. There would be no more interruptions, no more distractions. The funeral, though marked by tragedy, would honor the life of a soldier who had given everything for his country. And despite the chaos that had unfolded, General Turner knew that she, too, had played her part in ensuring that this day, this final tribute, was carried out with the respect it deserved. News of the attempted assassination at Arlington National Cemetery spread like wildfire. Within hours, the footage from the cemetery was all over the news, circulating through social media and every major news outlet. The grainy cell phone videos of Officer Mark Riddell pointing his gun at General Emily Turner were replayed over and over again, each broadcast sparking more outrage and disbelief. People struggled to comprehend what had transpired. How could a police officer, sworn to protect and serve, act with such violence, especially in such a sacred setting? Public opinion shifted rapidly. The media, the military, civil rights groups, and law enforcement all demanded answers. Questions flooded in. What had driven Riddell to take such drastic action? Was this an isolated incident, or was there something deeper at play? The narrative quickly moved from a singular attack on General Turner to a broader examination of law enforcement and the abuse of power that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Officer Riddell's background was scrutinized in great detail. A 15-year veteran of the Fairfax County Police Department, He had received numerous commendations for bravery throughout his career. On the surface, his record seemed spotless. But as investigators dug deeper, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Riddell had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years: excessive force allegations, racial profiling accusations, and incidents where body camera footage had disappeared or been conveniently unavailable. These complaints had been buried under layers of internal reviews and technicalities. His reputation as a man prone to aggression was well known in the department, yet no serious action had ever been taken against him. General Turner's voice, which had once been a symbol of authority and calm during the crisis, was now central to the public debate. Her testimony was crucial, and when she was called to speak, the courtroom was filled with military officers, veterans, and a host of journalists from all over the country. The trial became a national spectacle, a place where law enforcement's accountability, or lack thereof, would be put on trial. Riddell's defense team scrambled, trying to build a case around the idea that Riddell had acted under intense stress. They argued that he had been overwhelmed by personal and professional pressures, which had caused him to snap in the moment. They even attempted to portray him as a victim of the high crime rates in his jurisdiction, arguing that this had pushed him to the brink. But the prosecution's case was solid. They presented a damning array of evidence: Riddell's past disciplinary record, the video footage from the funeral, and the testimonies of those who had been there that day. Colonel Jason Hayes, who had been at the scene, was one of the key witnesses. His testimony was emotional but direct, recounting how Riddell had raised his weapon at General Turner with cold determination. "I knew right then that if we hadn't acted fast, General Turner would be dead," Hayes said in his testimony, his voice unwavering. The room was silent as the jury listened intently. Then came Captain Greg Daniels, who had tackled Riddell and prevented him from firing. His words were simple but powerful. "I saw his eyes," Daniels said. "He wasn't scared, he wasn't confused, he was determined. And that's what scared me the most." The prosecution also played the footage from the funeral again, freezing the frame at the exact moment Riddell aimed his gun. The courtroom was still, every eye fixed on the screen. It was a chilling moment, the stark contrast between the calm, composed General Turner and the chaos unfolding in front of her. Finally, the most damning evidence came when the prosecution played Riddell's interrogation tape. In it, he was asked why he had done it. His voice, raw and filled with rage, answered, "She doesn't belong here. Not in that uniform, not in that position. This country..." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. His own words had sealed his fate. As the trial reached its climax, the jury deliberated for only 3 hours. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Riddell had acted not just as a rogue cop, but as a man fueled by prejudice, a man who had used his badge as a shield for his own hatred. When the verdict came, it was swift. The jury found Riddell guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, and hate crime enhancements. The courtroom erupted in shock and disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, military officers exchanged glances, and families of the victims and witnesses held their breath. Riddell sat motionless at the defense table, his face drained of color. His attorney leaned in, whispering to him, but Riddell's expression never changed. He was a man cornered, a man who had once wielded power over others, but had now lost it all. The courtroom fell silent as the judge, a former military officer himself, stood to deliver the sentencing. Judge Robert Langley, his face grim and determined, looked directly at Officer Mark Riddell, who sat motionless, his hands clenched in tight fists. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. The entire courtroom, from the reporters to the military personnel, was waiting for the final words that would determine Riddell's fate. "Mr. Riddell," Judge Langley began, his voice steady and commanding, "you spent 15 years as an officer of the law. Your badge was meant to protect and serve. Instead, you used it as a shield for your own prejudice, for your own anger. You aimed a gun at a woman, an unarmed woman, at a funeral, a woman who has dedicated her life to this country, a woman who outranks you in every sense of the word." Riddell's face remained emotionless as the judge continued. "You tried to take her life in front of dozens of witnesses, in front of the very people who had come to honor their fallen comrade. And the only reason you could give for this horrific act was that she didn't belong in that uniform. Well, Mr. Riddell, I can tell you this. You don't belong outside of a prison cell. There was a long pause as the room held its breath. The gallery was so silent that you could hear the soft shuffle of feet, the sound of anticipation filling the space. Judge Langley's gavel came down with finality. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, relief, and murmurs of approval. Military officers exchanged solemn nods. Some of the victims' families, still processing the trauma of what had happened, allowed themselves a moment of quiet relief. The sentence was a victory for justice, but it was bittersweet. The damage had already been done. Riddell didn't react immediately. He sat there, his face ashen, his jaw clenched so tightly it was almost painful to watch. His attorney whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. As the guards moved toward him, he finally stood, but his movements were stiff, his shoulders hunched. His body language screamed defeat. The once arrogant cop who had walked into that courtroom with a sense of entitlement was now a broken man being led away in handcuffs. General Turner, standing at the back of the room, watched him being escorted out. She didn't smile, didn't show any outward signs of satisfaction. There was no triumph in her eyes. She had never expected to feel that way. What had happened was tragic. A man had been lost to his own hatred, and the consequences of that hatred had cost him everything. For her, there was no victory, only the quiet assurance that justice had been served. 2 weeks after the sentencing, the country continued to grapple with the fallout. The case had sent shockwaves through the entire nation, sparking a fierce debate about law enforcement, racism, and the abuse of power. But General Turner remained silent. She gave no interviews, no press conferences, no statements. She let the world talk. Finally, 2 weeks after the trial, she made a public appearance. Not for the media, but for the soldiers under her command at a military base in South Carolina. The young cadets sat in a room, their eyes filled with curiosity and respect as she stood before them. Her speech was short, but its impact was profound. Some of you may look at me and wonder how I stood there without fear, she said, her voice calm yet powerful. Some of you may think it was strength, maybe courage, maybe defiance. But the truth is simpler than that. I stood there because I knew something that Mark Riddell didn't understand. Power is not given through a gun. It is not given through a badge. It is not given through a uniform. True power is in how you choose to carry yourself, how you serve others, how you stand for something greater than yourself. She paused, letting the words settle in. The moment you forget that, you're no different from him. The room was silent for a moment, and then the cadets began to clap. It wasn't loud or celebratory, but firm and steady. They understood. They understood the message. It wasn't about the confrontation at Arlington or the media frenzy that followed. It was about something much deeper: integrity, respect, and the true meaning of leadership. The story of Officer Mark Riddell would be remembered, but not for the reasons he had hoped. His actions exposed the flaws in the system, but the story of General Emily Turner would be remembered for what she proved. She had faced the gun with dignity, with courage, and with an unwavering commitment to her principles. In the end, the lesson was clear. A badge doesn't make you right. A gun doesn't make you powerful. And justice, when it is done right, doesn't care what uniform you wear.